Hi everyone, Rachel Weaver here. I am on faculty as well as staff at Lighthouse Writers Workshop. I have been making these videos, a crafting series of short videos in which I've been asking different members of Lighthouse's faculty to talk about a certain crafting topic. So today I have Mario Acevedo with us. Thanks for being here, Mario.
It's my pleasure. Great to see you.
Nice
So
to
great, the brave new world now, right, that we live in.
Brave new Zoom world.
Yes.
I've asked Mario to talk to us about world building, and Mario, you have a slideshow you're going to share with us, correct?
Yes, I will.
Okay, let me make your video big here, and then we'll let you get going. Okay, you're all set.
All right, so hopefully everybody sees this. So let me get it going here. Where is it going? Okay. All right, so welcome to Lighthouse and the Writers Workshop. And then we're talking about world building, and there's, in case you know how to spell my name. So in world building, there's three things to think about. And there's the first aspect, which is time, place, and then something that people forget a lot is mood. So in talking about time, we have to think about where are we in the story's timeline, meaning are we in a contemporary world? If we're writing historical fiction, where are we there? If we're writing some supernatural story or a science fiction story, where are we? If you're in a time like a family timeline, are we talking about maybe something that started in your grandparents' time? So that's basically the timeline, and we establish that at the beginning of the story. And then we talk about the place, and usually, of course, we think about geography. Where are we? What city are we in? But also think about in society. What part of society are we in? What kind of government structure are we in? The culture that we are in, the economy, the clothing, the language, food, science and magic, just sort of how things work in this particular world. Now, if you're writing something contemporary story, like talking about a family story, then the geography and the time that we're in now pretty much sets that as what you expect. Maybe the economy, what is your family situation, economic? I mean, that's something to think about, especially right now in this time. The language that you have, if you're writing a supernatural story, if you're a science fiction story, of course, you're going to be thinking about the science and the magic components. And then mood. What is the mood of your story? That's something that people forget about. Is it festive? Are people at the beginning of the story, are they happy? Are they expecting something? For example, if you're writing a family saga, maybe it starts with one of your main characters is actually expecting a baby. How does that affect the story? And what is the mood about that? Are they festive about it? They're happy to see it? Or they're like, oh my God, here she is again with another baby that expecting the rest of the family help taken care of. So there's that anxiety aspect of it, or fear. If you're writing a post-apocalyptic story, usually it starts from a position of fear. So those are the things to think about in your story when you're world building. And the thing to think about in world building is the more alien and unusual the world is to your reader, the more details and context you need to provide. So if you're writing a contemporary story, you really don't have to explain how money works or the clothing that they wear or how the economy is or the details about the weather and so. But if you're writing a story, let's say set in a hospital, what's going on in the hospital? What's the culture of the hospital? What kind of a structure is going on there? How do the people relate to one another? That's something we really don't think about. How about if you, of course, set it on another world, if you set it in a historical setting, what's going on there? Right? Where are we? How does the law work in ancient Rome, for example? How can you get arrested? How do you pay fines in ancient Rome? What kind of a dynamic is going on there? So, and if you're writing historical or a supernatural story, your audience wants you to really get into those details. They want that immersion that you have. Now, like I said, if you're writing a contemporary story, the immersion is kind of easy. You say, well, my grandmother's house today. Everybody's like, okay, where was that? And you say in Iowa. All right, we kind of have that. We understand how that all figures together. So hopefully I've given some that you need to start world building. So remember, it's all about time, place, and mood. And then lastly, don't start writing your story no matter what. The water doesn't flow until the faucet is turned on. And that comes from Louis L'Amour, who published over 120 novels. So hopefully I've given you something to start with on world building. You have any questions there, Rachel? Anything?
I do.
Go ahead.
Hold on a second. Let me get us back to where we're both on here. There we go. Yes, I have a question. So you teach workshops at Lighthouse Writers Workshop. You are also on faculty at Regis University's MFA program. You work with a lot.
As you are too.
As I am too.
Okay.
You work with a lot of students who are writing speculative fiction, and I wonder, what are some of the common mistakes people make surrounding world building when they are in an early draft phase? What are some things that you could identify as more common mistakes? Or maybe I shouldn't say mistakes, but like, you know, sort of issues, like ways that it slows the story down, or problems.
Oh, okay. I think one of them is how the world affects the individual. For example, I was reading a story and they had dragons show up. And I just wanted to know, I didn't understand reading like the first couple of chapters. Is that a normal thing in your world to have dragons show up? I mean, what does that actually mean in that particular world? So that's how you world build it. And another one is to kind of, it's like writing descriptions in a story. You want enough to place the reader in, and you want the descriptions to actually move the plot along. You don't want to bog down the story too much in description. Writing descriptions is actually easy, and it's actually fun. And we have to learn how to pull back on that and just give the reader enough to keep them grounded in the story so they're not asking the wrong questions. We want the readers to ask the questions about what's next with the characters. You know, what would you expect with them, as opposed to them asking, well, where are we in the world? I don't understand. You know, what we were in one place, now we're in something else, in someplace else. So, you know, we want to build a world in a way that that answers a lot of questions in the reader's mind, that helps fill what they want. Sometimes, though, another thing to think about is not too bad too much, because the world actually becomes more vivid the more the reader kind of fills in the blanks in that regard. So
I think that's a hard balance to strike, though, because you're not sure your reader is going to fill in the right blanks or fill in the blanks the way you want them to, right? And so the tendency is to overwrite, to make sure, you know, your reader, it's created in your reader's mind in the same way it's created, you know, the world looks in your mind, right?
This is true. This is true. And for example, I will read a book. It was a favorite book of mine, and I read it 20 years ago, and then I read it today, and all of a sudden, the world is a little different. I see it different because, like, there's that saying, you can only write half of the book, and you, the reader, writer writes half the book, but the reader fills in the other half. And so that's the challenge, is to impart that emotional experience that you want to the reader in the way that you as the writer intended to do it. So that, it takes time to learn how to do that. I also think that I think a good writing group helps. I always tell readers or writers to get in a good writing group, because they can help you sort that out. If you write something and they come back and they're asking questions, you're like, okay, they're asking me the wrong questions. So now I know what I have to fill in. So that always helps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then my other question, the thing that I've noticed the most about, when I've had students in classes of my own that are working on speculative fiction in particular. But you're right, I thought that was an interesting point you make about the level of world building that has to happen within any world that you place a story in, right? Because your reader is potentially not a part of, that hospital world or the military world or whatever it is.
Well, I would like to refer to that story that you read at Regis where you were on the boat. Remember that? And you probably didn't think about his world building, but you had all those details about the boat and how those details and those questions about how we're navigating that boat affected the couple, right? And that added another level of tension to the story there. And I thought you did a very good job doing that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting though, because I've never really thought of, fiction writers outside of speculative fiction writers employing so many of the same tools. But you're making me realize that that does happen. Certainly. One thing I've noticed though is that people tend and I wonder if you agree with me, but it seems like a lot of times writers will front load a story with lots and lots and lots of world building details. So I wonder what advice you have about that. Maybe you already talked about this in that you want to give the reader enough detail to have to feel grounded in the world, but focus their questions on those driving questions, those questions that have to do with plot and character, not like where are we, what those confusing questions.
Right. I was just thinking about something about Zoom right now, where one of the issues is this lack of physical reading the other person. And I
Yeah.
find myself leaning forward when I want to say something here. Uh, so, I think also a lot of it depends on your audience. I think, for example, if you're writing like a big epic fantasy story, readers want those details. I mean, if you're talking about some castle, and if you were to add like 2 pages of description and the history about the castle, the reader's like, yeah, this is exactly what I want. And then, of course, make it relevant to the story. So that would be one thing. Now, on the other hand, if you're writing a story set like in a hospital, how much information are you going to put in there, right? I mean, you can really go down the rabbit hole of research and give a little bit too much. And then a lot of us are maybe familiar with that kind of a setting enough to know that just give us enough so we understand what's going on in the story. So it's an interesting balancing act, one depending on what kind of story you want to tell, and of course who your audience is. On the other hand, I've read stories that are kind of like epic fantasy that don't give pages and pages of description. They tend to be a little more sparse in that. I think another story for me that did a really good job of world building is if you read The Lincoln Lawyer by Michael Conley. It's about a lawyer, a contemporary lawyer in Los Angeles, and he works out of the back of a Lincoln limousine. So there's that whole world building about that aspect of it. But then he gives you a lot of detail about all the limitations that he as a lawyer has when he talks to his clients. So he leads you through when he goes into the courtroom, and there's lines painted on the courtroom floor, which is the limits where he can stand where he talks to his client. And then he talks about how money is exchanged from his client, and then what happens if they give him cash. Well, he can't accept cash; he has to accept a check, right? And then he talks about why that is. So in that aspect, it was a great job at building the world that this lawyer lives in, and how he made it so relevant to the story. So that's a good example of a contemporary story where world building is an integral part of the overall story, and it sort of shapes the world that the character has to move through in a way that's very relevant to you as a reader.
Right. And it sounds to me, especially with that example, is placement is super important, right? So if your character says, no, I can't take cash, then you spark a question in the reader's mind, right? Like, why not?
Yeah.
Then we get the descriptive sentence of why he can only take checks, or perhaps it comes out in his dialogue, but it's a matter of world building, or placing that world building detail potentially in a place where the reader suddenly has a question about it, right? So beforehand, it wouldn't work as well if the writer was like, well, and when you're a lawyer, you can't this fashion, you can only take checks, and you know what I mean? Like, it seems like the placement of the world building is also a key component.
Well, another place for the world building, for example, if you're writing a family story, is the world within the family, right? And think about how those dynamics and how you explain that, and that, let's say they get together to dinner, and if you're writing a good dinner story, there's always conflict, there's always a fight. So you have to set that world up around the dinner table. So so all the little details about who brought what food, if it's a potluck, for example, and so that every character, when they bring a dish for the potluck, that signifies something, right? And of course, the other characters are very judging, like, oh, you always bring that, right? Or you've never got that recipe right. When are you going to do it right? That kind of thing. So it adds another level of tension to the story, which I think is makes the story more interesting and it makes the story more immersive for us as readers.
Right, and it sounds like you can do a lot of that world building through dialogue.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
And a little bit about description. I think the description is of course important. And the other aspect with description is what we call theme-based imagery. So you describe colors that are relevant to the scene. The one that I use quite a lot is like if a character, if she has red lipstick, well, if it's a noir story, then it would be a blood red lipstick, right? But if you want to make fun of her, then you would say it was clown red. Right, even though it's the same exact color, you just described it differently, and that sets up the image of the characters in the reader's mind.
Right, and also potentially adds to the mood, like you were saying.
Yes, yes. Raymond Chandler was very good with using descriptors in that. But I would have cautioned the writer, if you go too far, then it becomes camp, right? So maybe in a paragraph, have 2 or 3 descriptive words, descriptive phrases, and then just sort of leave that enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, Mario. Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks for letting me ask you a bunch of questions.
Oh no, thank you very much. I appreciate you doing this. We'll get through this pandemic sooner or later.
Yes.
Hopefully. And hopefully everybody, I think they're going to do a Zoom workshops at Lighthouse. I mean at Litfest.
Yes, our very first virtual Lit Fest. So in the description of this video, when it gets posted on YouTube, there will be a link to both Mario's website, so you can check out his work, and a link to the class you'll be teaching in at Litfest.
Okay, well, great.
All right, thanks, Mario.
Okay, you take care now. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.